It's a great thrill for a Dickensian to be here in Barnard's Inn Hall. I must be standing just a few yards away from the site where Pip, in Great Expectations, 200 years ago, because the novel was set back in the second, third decade of the 19th century, on a dark and very stormy night, Pip heard the footsteps on the stairs of his benefactor returning from Australia to greet his gentleman again. I can almost feel the reverberations. Anyway, my topic is on Dickens's transition from a writer to a public performer of his works. Dickens had three professional careers. He was a novelist, he was a journalist, and he was a professional public reader for the last 12 years of his life. And those of you who heard Michael Slater's talk last week will realize from that the way in which he so deftly set the context that this extraordinary new career of Dickens's blossomed really in the last decade of his life. I'm going to organize it in, as it were, a chronological order. So to move from his work at his writing desk and how he set about that, to the modes of composition that he employed, especially in the creation of his characters, to the point where he stood up before his readership, 1,000 or 2,000 sometimes at one go in auditoriums, and read these works to them live. It was this third career of his as a public reader, professional public reader, was extraordinarily lucrative. Dickens's estate at his death was around £93,000, and about half of that was estimated to have been income derived from his public readings. So it was extraordinarily profitable for him. Anyway, I'm going to start Dickens at his writing desk, from improvisation to planning in the middle period, how he set to work to create the novels, and then considering the way in which the writer is in a peculiarly isolated position, and how Dickens at his solitary writing desk craved the companionship of the readership that he couldn't see, and devised all sorts of means in order to create a special kind of rapport with that invisible readership. And to move from there to his initiating this new career and devising the reading desk and the various props, the whole ensemble, because he was a manic controller. So all of the apparatus necessary for him to maximize the effect of his readings was devised largely by him. And then at the end, we'll see Dickens returning rather reluctantly, turning away from the performance lectern, the stage, back to his private desk. So it comes full circle. We start with this quotation on that first slide. "I've often thought that I should certainly have been as successful on the boards as I have been between them." And Dickens was a very shrewd judge of his own talents. Well, here is Dickens at his desk in a photo posed, obviously, I think, in a photographer's studio, as well as various other images of him. And there were many, many of these images of Dickens at his desk in the act of creation. And I'll come back to some of these later. His desk was immaculate. When he came in the morning to his desk, wherever he was writing, whichever house he was in, whether he was abroad on holiday, everything on the desk had to be exactly shipshape, clean, tidy, orderly. Dickens was very much a kind of control freak in terms of personal discipline and disciplining the space around him. It seems odd, doesn't it, that this is the case with Dickens, who seems in so many other ways to cross all sorts of boundaries. And indeed, getting up to give public readings of his books was in some ways transgressing a boundary at the time. But maybe it's the case that because he had this wild, vagabond imagination, he needed a kind of regularizing framework. Anyway, the whole family was subject to this manic discipline. Here is his daughter, Mamie, recalling his father's habit of inspecting the house every day. He made a point of visiting every room in the house once each morning. And if a chair was out of its place, or a blind not quite straight, or a crumb left on the floor, woe betide the offender. In spite of this extraordinary discipline, Dickens was able to compose in the very early stages of his career with extraordinary freedom and spontaneity, and to be able to improvise. This is a manuscript page from Oliver Twist, which he wrote in Doughty Street, 48 Doughty Street, his first family home, where the first of his children were born, which is now, of course, the Charles Dickens Museum in Doughty Street. And here's an account given by his brother-in-law. One night in Doughty Street, Mrs. Charles Dickens, my wife, and myself were sitting round the fire, cosily enjoying a chat, when Dickens, for some purpose, came suddenly from his study into the room. "What, you here?" he exclaimed. "I'll bring down my work." It was his monthly portion of Oliver Twist for Bentley's. In a few minutes he returned, manuscript in hand, and while he was pleasantly discoursing, he employed himself in carrying to a corner of the room a little table at which he seated himself and recommenced his writing. We, at his bidding, went on talking our little nothings. He, every now and then, the feather of his pen still moving rapidly from side to side, put in a cheerful interlude. It was interesting to watch upon the sly the mind and the muscles working or playing in company as new thoughts were being dropped upon the paper, and to note the working brow, the set mouth, with the tongue slightly pressed against the closed lips, as was his habit. It's extraordinary that Dickens could be creating this novel, scenes of Oliver in Fagin's den, while he was in his own cosy middle-class drawing room chatting with his wife and family. As time went by, this capacity to improvise freely changed pretty drastically, and the extraordinarily clean manuscript page of Oliver Twist that you see there on the left turned into the densely corrected manuscript page of the Tale of Two Cities and other novels. As time went by, he found it harder and harder. He became more and more pernickety about getting just the right phrase. So all sorts of crossings out, and that old spontaneity had gone, as increasingly he mastered the art of the novelist. One friend who came into Dickens' study late on in Dickens's career caught sight of one of these later manuscripts and said to Dickens, how on earth can you do without somebody doing a fair copy? Can't you get a secretary to type out a fair copy for the printers? It must be a nightmare for them. And Dickens said, no, I've discovered that if you send that kind of copy to the printer, they give it to the seasoned veterans of the printing house, because they're the only ones who can read my writing like that. If I make a fair copy, they give it to the apprentices, and the apprentices make a terrible mess of it. So Dickens, canny as ever, continued to refuse fair copying of his manuscripts. But in the middle period of his writing, say from the mid-1840s onwards, that free improvisation gave way to much more scrupulous planning. Dickens would establish a governing theme and then a plot that was carefully calculated to articulate that theme. Whereas in Pickwick and Oliver Twist, he just rolled on from month to month, thinking hardly very far ahead. He got 2/3 of the way through writing Oliver Twist when a dramatization of Oliver Twist, there were several that began to appear on the London stage. And of course, these dramatizations had to invent an ending for the novel, which hadn't actually reached its conclusion. One ending seemed particularly ingenious, and a friend asked Dickens, aren't you a little bit alarmed that somebody might anticipate the ending that you've got in mind, might guess it and put it on stage? And Dickens said, no, I don't think that can be the case, because I haven't even worked out how it's going to end myself. So he was happily and confidently inventing all the time, until, as I say, this middle period, the late 1840s, and you can see in this slide how different, for example, the cover design for Little Dorrit is from the one of Pickwick Papers. In Pickwick Papers, you simply have hunting, fishing, shooting motifs, enclosing an image of Pickwick in a punt and Mr. Winkle shooting at the top, because Dickens couldn't tell his designer what the course of the story overall was going to be. By the time of Little Dorrit, he knew very well what it was going to be. And so it was going to be this enormous, ambitious Condition of England novel. So at the top you have Britannia in her chariot and the lords in front of the commoners behind her, and then the middle class and so on. And the church, institution and state on right and left. And he's got this portrait in mind of England, which the plot involving Little Dorrit and Arthur Clenham is going to articulate. He's increasingly scrupulous too about the tiniest details, the names of the characters, major and minor characters, as well, of course, as the title, and would prepare these working notes, taking a sheet of paper, folding it in two, and on the left side there, as a kind of checklist agenda. He would scribble down the names of characters and then tick them off when he'd introduce them into that installment. And then on the right, you have the chapter titles and summaries of what goes on in the chapters. This one enables one to see the trial titles for David Copperfield, and he took a lot of trouble. He went through many, many versions of that, as well as Mr. Murdstone, how that name emerges on the left-hand side of the opening there. First of all, he's going to be Mr. Harden, and then Mr. Merdle, and then Murdstone, and then murder underneath. So Dickens is working with this sense of the way in which the name, like an Elizabethan humour figure, the name is going to denote the nature of the character. Well, after some time in serializing all of these novels, Dickens begins to become increasingly skillful in, as it were, trying to integrate the sequence of events, the pace of the novel, with the day-to-day or month-to-month lives of his readers. And this is a way of closing the gap, as it were, between him, the storyteller, and the readers themselves, and between his fictional world, his imaginary world, and the real world of people. This is why Dickens is so often It's so often suggested that Dickens would be a very ingenious writer of soaps. Soaps that engulf the lives of those who follow them on television or radio. Around the time when he is beginning to start this planning, Dickens declares in a preface to Master Humphrey's Clock, which housed the Old Curiosity Shop and Barnaby Rudge, in a short address to his readers, he says, "To commune with you in any form is to me a labour of love. To commune with you in any form is to me a labour of love." It's almost prophetic of the way in which he's later going to commune with them face to face in the halls all around Britain and in America. A labour of love. So here in his working notes for Little Dorrit, just to give one instance, he's bringing together a group of disparate people at the beginning of the novel in quarantine, topical, in Marseille. Before they return to England. They have to stay there in quarantine, having landed at Marseille port and on the way to England for a period. They slightly get to know each other and then they part. And Dickens writes a little memo to himself, thinking that this is a good strategy to develop in a serial novel. People to meet and part as travellers do, and the future connection between them in the story, not to be now shown to the reader, but to be worked out as in life. Try this uncertainty and this not putting of them together as a new means of interest. Indicate and carry through this intention. As in life. So he's aligning the pace of development in his fictional world with that of experience in the real world, and grafting, as it were, his imaginary world more closely over our real lives, or his contemporary readers' real lives. This is a way of bringing people closer together, hooking them in. Writing is a lonely business, and particularly for someone with Dickens's own very strong needs. A need particularly to be able to create this community between the writer and the readers. And I've read out one quotation already to you: "To commune with you in any form is to me a labour of love." But here, in Nicholas Nickleby, Dickens's third novel, he becomes a bit more florid in his addresses, his quite personal addresses to the reader. When he finishes the serialization of Nicholas Nickleby, after just over a year and a half, he writes the preface. And in the course of the preface, he quotes a writer, an 18th century writer, as follows. He's quoting Henry Mackenzie. "The author of a periodical performance commits to his readers the feelings of the day in the language which those feelings have prompted. And as he has delivered himself with the freedom of intimacy and the cordiality of friendship, he will naturally look for the indulgence which those relations may claim. And when he bids his readers adieu, will hope as well as feel the regrets of an acquaintance and the tenderness of a friend." Obviously sentiments that Dickens really warmed to. And now look at the closing paragraph by Dickens himself. "With such feelings and such hopes, the periodical essayist, the author of these pages," Nicholas Nickleby, "now lays them before his readers in a completed form, flattering himself, like the writer just quoted, that on the 1st of next month they may miss his company at the accustomed time, as something which used to be expected with pleasure, and think of the papers which on that day of so many past months they have read, as the correspondence of one who wished their happiness and contributed to their amusement. Reluctant to say farewell, and hoping that his readers will miss him. And as if to reinforce this very personal rapport that Dickens was trying to develop with his readership, he and his publishers decide to put a little oval portrait of Dickens, an engraving of the famous Maclise portrait, as the frontispiece. The first time, really, Dickens is glimpsed by his readership, but Dickens wants to show himself as well as express his closeness of feeling. In addition to that, instead of printing underneath Charles Dickens by Daniel Maclise, they print a facsimile of Dickens's own signature. So he signs himself off to his reader, "Faithfully yours, Charles Dickens." You could hardly get much more personal as a writer with a readership that you can't see. This sense of correspondence, think of the papers which on that day of so many past months they have read as the correspondence of one who wished their happiness and contributed to their amusement. The idea of a novel as correspondence from the author is something that, I was going to say tickles Dickens' fancy, but is actually much more vital to him. Here are some more remarks that Dickens makes on this subject, writing to friends. "I wish you would regard my Christmas books and Dombeys and so forth as letters to you." And again, "I really think so often of my friends in writing my books, and have the happiness of knowing they think so much of reading them, that I have a sort of stupid sense as if they served for letters." So, this strongly personal need for communication grows and grows on Dickens, and the need to establish some particular kind of rapport. Curiously, not curiously, I suppose, naturally enough, the framework idea for Dickens's very first book involved the idea of letter-written reports coming in at various intervals. And this is Pickwick Papers. Here's the agenda at the beginning of Pickwick Papers. That the corresponding society, the society that keeps in touch through letters, of the Pickwick Club is therefore hereby constituted. And the members are named, and they are requested to forward from time to time authenticated accounts of their journeys and investigations, observations of character and manners, which is exactly what Dickens is doing month by month in Pickwick Papers. And this sets a lifelong pattern for the nature of Dickens's relationship with his readers. Have a look at the obituary from the Illustrated London News on the same slide. It was just as if, the immediate personal companionship between the writer and the reader, third or fourth line. It was just as if we received a letter or a visit at regular intervals from a kindly observant gossip who was in the habit of watching the domestic life of the Nicklebys or the Chuzzlewits and would let us know from time to time how they were going on. That was the core of the relationship. There was no assumption, it goes on to say, in general, of having a complete and finished history to deliver. He came at fixed periods merely to report what he had perceived since his last budget. This is probably the key reason why Dickens resolved to continue to issue his novels in serial form, monthly or weekly, because it sustained that regular communication with his readership, which if he had worked on a novel for a year or so and then published it and issued it in the standard 3 volumes, he would lose that personal touch, that personal connection between himself and his public. Well, I've said that writing is a lonely business, and Dickens certainly felt that acutely. So created this communication, insofar as he was able to, as a solitary author, between himself and his readership. But he also created a community between him and his characters, who formed a company for him. And there are many, as I said at the beginning, many of these cartoons or capriccios of Dickens surrounded by his characters, the characters that he has created, who then become his companions. Dickens's son Charlie, his oldest son Charlie, bore witness to the importance to Dickens of the companionship of his characters. He lived, I'm sure, two lives, one with us and one with his fictitious people, and I'm equally certain that the children of his brain were much more real to him at times than we were. I have often and often heard him complain that he could not get the people of his imagination to do what he wanted, and that they would insist on working out their histories in their way and not his. I can very well remember his describing their flocking round his table in the quiet hours of a summer morning, when he was, an unusual circumstance with him, at work very early, each one of them claiming and demanding instant personal attention. The exercise of composition of these characters, who were to help sustain him in his loneliness in his study, is quite complicated. There are various versions of Dickens at work, various accounts and speculations of Dickens at work, and indeed various versions of the act of creation that Dickens himself testified to. One is a kind of passivity. In this famous painting, Dickens's Dream, we see the author detached from his desk in a kind of reverie. And here's some comments from Dickens and from a friend of his, G.H. Lewis. Dickens once declared to me that every word said by his characters was distinctly heard by him. And Dickens, when I sit down to my book, some beneficent power shows it all to me and tempts me to be interested, and I don't invent it, really do not, but see it and write it down. So it's as though he doesn't have to do anything. He simply gets himself in a certain frame of mind, and the story and the characters come up spontaneously in front of him. And that's presumably why R.W. Buss conceives of the painting in this way, of these characters in groups or singles swirling about him like ectoplasm, as though this kind of creative energy is just evaporating from him and filling the void. The other kind of creation is not at all passive, and this draws on the famous account by Dickens's daughter Mamie. On one occasion in the 1850s, when she was ill, she was allowed into Dickens's study. He never brought anyone else in, because it would distract him, as it were, distract him from his necessary solitude. And he said, nobody else is in the house to look after her. He said, please just lie on the couch and try and keep as quiet as possible, unless you feel particularly ill, in which case let me know. So Mamie watched her father at work at his desk and saw that every now and again he would suddenly jump up and go over to one of the many mirrors in the room and start making faces in the mirror. Go back to his desk and start writing very busily, and get up again, go back over to the mirror, make more faces, sometimes making sounds, strange voices into the mirror as he watched the contortions of expression in the mirror, and then look into the middle distance and go back to his desk and write again. So here he was creating and almost auditioning his characters in front of the mirror, their voices and their looks, so that he could then describe, as it were, what he saw in his imagination when he put quill to paper. He evidently had a very particular knowledge of every single movement of his characters, how they looked, how they spoke. He told one friend that he knew much more about his characters than were ever written in the book. So they had a life outside the book which never got into the book. And he would occasionally pose for the illustrator to indicate the sort of posture that he wanted when the illustrator was saying, well, how would Mr. Jasper look in The Mystery of Edwin Drood, as in here. So this combination of a craving of close rapport with his public and the impulse in his study to perform his characters, the combination of these two could only lead to one outcome, and that is to head towards the stage. Dickens was a born actor, could have made an acting career, certainly persuaded those who saw him act that he was immensely gifted. There's the comment by one stagehand who had been involved in one of Dickens's amateur theatricals, who confided to Dickens when they were alone together, "What an actor you would have been, Mr. Dickens, if it hadn't been for them books." Dickens had a delight in inhabiting other characters, a particular delight, and in organizing amateur theatricals. And there's one comment that he makes, which I think is very significant for what I'm coming on to now. And this is at the bottom of this slide. He's talking about The Frozen Deep, the fateful play in which he takes the lead part. As to the play itself, when it is made as good as my care can make it, I derive a strange feeling of it, like writing a book in company. A satisfaction of a most singular kind, which has no exact parallel in my life. So writing a book in company, in a way, is what I've tried to describe he was doing, except that the company was virtual. On the stage, he's with a group of other people, that's one company, and he's in front of an audience, that's another company. And this is a much more invigorating, inspiring experience of creation, of character creation on stage. And so Dickens decides to take the plunge and to convert these occasional readings for charity into a professional career. As a means, as he says here, of strengthening those relations, I may almost say of personal friendship, which is my great privilege and pride, and my responsibility to hold with a multitude of persons who will never hear my voice nor see my face. And so I come among you here to deliver my novels in person on stage, which he did. And I'm going on to look at some of the preparations that he made for this. It's important to stress that the readings were for Dickens, a kind of compromise between private drawing room entertainment and public theatre. No doubt he wanted the full experience of public theatre, but he presented himself as a gentleman in white tie and tails behind a desk, delivering a kind of drawing room entertainment. He never strayed either side from his desk. He kept that discipline. Furthermore, he hardly ever gave readings, and he gave about 475 readings in North America and in Britain. And he very seldom gave them in theatres, in public theatres. He preferred mechanics institutes, concert rooms, assembly rooms, town halls, and so on. Here he is experimenting with various desks. first ones that only revealed his face, and then bit by bit his own devised desk there on the right. When I first entered on this interpretation of myself, I was sustained by the hope that I could drop into some heart some new expression of the meaning of my books that would touch them in a new way. Some new expression of the meaning of my books that would touch them in a new way. We'll come on to this new expression of books. This is Dickens's own drawing of the reading desk that he eventually devised. So instead of this very high kind of pulpit lectern, which concealed most of him, he reduced it to the point where he could free the whole of his upper body to be able to give gestures and full physical as well as facial expression to his readings. And it was this desk that he devised and had specially made that he took around America, as well as all over Britain. And this, we don't have any really helpful, detailed visual description of the set itself, but there was a sounding board behind Dickens because he had to project without microphone out to halls where there might be 1,500 people. And sometimes people simply didn't hear him, however much he tried to doctor the acoustics. He and his team tried to doctor the acoustics. But he read in a frame of gas jets, bright gas jets that would illuminate him pretty fiercely. And he traveled with a special lighting man, a gas man, as well as 2 or 3 other people, and his manager, a crew of about 4 or 5, all the way around America and Britain, with this collapsible, movable set. Of course, gas, having to plug gas into the supplies in halls everywhere he went, was a rather perilous business. And there were several mishaps. One I will just mention here, in Worcester, Massachusetts, at a reading, the hall where he was due to read, not a theatre again, had been prepared for a 3-day exhibition organized by the New England Poultry Club, and about 250 fowls were lodged overnight in premises just off the main hall. Come the time of the reading, the gas lights came up gently in the hall, and particularly when Dickens's stage lights were on full, the birds who had bedded down for the night saw the light seeping into their quarters, assumed it was dawn, and a crescendo of crowing accompanied Dickens's readings for some time. We have no sound recording, of course, of Dickens giving a reading, only ear witness records of how he impersonated his characters from these scripts that he devised himself. I'll give 1 or 2 examples of how a witness heard Dickens. This is Mrs. Gamp. Dickens's rendering of Mrs. Gamp. Take a comb, cover it with tissue paper, and attempt to sing through it, and you have an admirable idea of the quality of Mrs. Gamp's vocal organ, provided you make the proper allowance for an inordinate use of snuff. She holds all notions of light and shade in contempt, and with monotonous cadence produces effects on her readers undreamt of, on her hearers, undreamt of by her readers. Take a comb, and you make a strange sort of noise to represent Mrs. Gamp, the nurse, midwife, and attendant on the dead. Here she is. She's a tipsy widow of a husband who drank himself to death, and she might have sounded something like this when she's newly engaged to attend a family with a recent death. Oh, and so the gentleman's dead, sir. Oh, more's the pity. But it's what we must all come to. It's as certain as being born, except that we can't make our calculations as exact. Oh,
poor dear, when Gamp was summoned to his long home, and I sees him a-lying in the hospital with a penny piece on each eye, and his wooden leg under his left arm, I thought I should have fainted away. But I bore up. Oh, I bore up.
Dickens revelled in this kind of gruesome imagery, and I'm sorry if there are people listening to this over their lunch table, but Dickens transferred himself physically into his characters. Scrooge, the old wizened refrigerator who sheds chills around him, is built physically by Dickens to sound a certain way. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, made his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. Humbug! If I could work my will, every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled with his own pudding, and buried with a stake of holly through his heart he should. And when he comes to Fagin, in the famous reading of Sikes and Nancy, he transformed himself physically, turned his hands into talons and would claw the air. His voice was very subtly registered. There were many representations, stereotypical representations of Jews of Fagin's kind on the London stage. And people remarked how very different and how very much more natural Dickens's Fagin was. In fact, people generally at the readings were quite struck by the unexpectedly naturalistic manner of Dickens's impersonations of his famous figures. This is one of the most interesting things about these readings. And I think that Dickens's stage naturalism was a way for him to recuperate his characters from the cartoon caricatures they had become in the hands of Phiz and Leech and Cruikshank. In effect, Dickens, up there, night after night, on stage, in front of hundreds of his readers, was publishing new editions of his popular early works. His final devised piece was the infamous reading of Sikes and Nancy involving the murder of Nancy. Dickens was already ailing at this time, and it was to be in many ways fatal for him to continue with this, but against doctor's orders, he persevered. The little note on the left is his doctor's notes. Doctor would be in the wings for many of these later performances, registering Dickens's pulse rate. And I'm going to finish with one description, one, I think, very vivid description. It's not of Sikes and Nancy, it's a reading of Copperfield. And it's by Thackeray's daughter. And I'm not sure which reading it is. It's sometime probably in the middle of the 1860s when she's invited with Dickens's daughter, they were friends, to a performance of Dickens's reading of Copperfield in St. James's Hall. And I put up here a strange portrait of Dickens reading. I mean, it's not Dickens's reading desk. I don't know where it came from. It's currently housed in the Charles Dickens Museum, but it's very difficult to tell the date and who painted it. Anyway, it's useful for this particular purpose. We sat in front, a little to the right of the platform. The great hall was somewhat dimly lighted, considering the crowds assembled there. The slight figure stood alone, quietly facing the long rows of people. He seemed holding the great audience in some mysterious way from the empty stage. Quite immediately the story began. Copperfield and Steerforth, Yarmouth and the fisherman and Peggotty, and then the rising storm. All was there before us. It was not acting, it was not music, nor harmony of sound and colour, and yet I still have an impression of all these things as I think of that occasion. The lights shone from the fisherman's home. Then after laughter, terror fell. The storm rose. Finally, we were all breathlessly watching from the shore, and this I remember most vividly of all. A great wave seemed to fall splashing onto the platform from overhead, carrying away everything before it, and the boat and the figure of Steerforth in his red sailor's cap fighting for his life by the mast. Someone called out. Was it Mr. Dickens himself who threw up his arms? It was all over. We were half laughing, half crying with excitement, being at that special time still very much wrought up. Remembering the past, naturally, our emotions took shape. That is the full painting from which I detached this scene behind. But it's the only one I know that tries to give that impression of the way in which Dickens' stories came to life behind him and around him as he impersonated his characters and built his sets for the imagination of this audience. Well, Dickens' health broke down in the spring of 1869, possibly a minor stroke down his left side, and he was prone to occasional verbal stumbles. One night in London at a reading at St. James's Hall, his son was in the audience in the front row, and Dickens was reading the trial, and he couldn't pronounce the name Pickwick. Of all names, Dickens couldn't pronounce the name Pickwick because of this disabling stroke. He pronounced it Picksnick, Picnic, Peckwicks, struggled, and then gave a surprised grin to his son, who was obviously in a state of some panic. The reading stopped on doctor's orders and family insistence, and a series of farewell final readings in London was devised from February to March 1870. The last reading was the 15th of March, and Dickens read the trial and the Carol, Pickwick Trial and Carol, left the stage, thunderous applause. He came back onto the stage and gave a short speech, of which this is part. Ladies and gentlemen, in but 2 short weeks from this time, I hope that you may enter in your own homes on a new series of readings, at which my assistance will be indispensable. But from these garish lights, I vanish now forevermore, with a heartfelt, grateful, respectful, and affectionate farewell. Well, it wasn't really a farewell. Dickens couldn't say goodbye. In fact, as that implies, his audience was simply to become his readership again. So Dickens returns to his solitary writing desk and replaced his actual public presence with his virtual presence as the storyteller who guaranteed to pay his regular installment visits every month for his devoted readers. And alas, of course, it was a pledge that was too short-lived. For 12 weeks after this final performance at St. James's Hall, he had his fatal stroke at Gad's Hill. Thank you.
Professor Andrews, thank you very much for a fascinating lecture. It has inspired a few people online to ask some questions. So if I may present these to you, we won't be able to get to all of them, but I will try to do as many as possible. Did Dickens find British and American audiences for his readings reacted differently? And if so, how did he respond to this, for example, by choosing different pieces to read or by reading more or less dramatically?
Yes. The one report that I've picked up is that when Dickens returned from the American tour, his readings were more melodramatic, more pronounced, more flamboyant for his English audience than for the Americans. So whether it was because the Americans wanted something bigger, somehow more dramatic, more caricatured, I'm not sure. But there was a comment that I meant to read out here. Just bear with me 1 minute. Yes, this is this perhaps keys into that question about British and American audiences. Here's one report from an English magazine when the reviewer went to see Sikes and Nancy. It was a great study to watch the faces of the people, eager, excited, intent, permitted for once in a lifetime to be natural, forgetting to be British, and cynical and unimpassioned.
That's wonderful.
Yeah. So I think, and also in America, he was reading to much bigger halls, I think. So he had to amplify everything that he did much more. Maybe when he came back to the smaller English halls, that was too amplified, and he had to scale it down a bit.
I have a question from a PhD candidate at Cambridge who is defending her dissertation tomorrow. It is on reading prompt copies, his reading prompt copies. She says that you've inspired her today. My question is about, what do you think about Dickens' claims around his rehearsing of readings like Marigold 200 times, for instance, and the relationship between rehearsal and the prompt copies? The books themselves essentially become props by the end.
Yes, that's right, absolutely right. He did rehearse and rehearse and rehearse. He was a perfectionist. And towards the latter part of this reading career, he reported that he now knew all of his readings off by heart. There are about 16 separate texts of readings, and given that his performances lasted about 2 hours, it was an astonishing feat of memory. But I also wonder whether it wasn't due to his having 2 or 3 minor strokes, that certainly in one of the later strokes, he was partly paralyzed down the left-hand side. So it was hard for him to hold the book. So it was just as well that he learnt it off by heart. But yes, the book was there with him, I think, to reassure audiences who were a bit Victorian prudish, perhaps, about going to the theatre, that they weren't in a theatre, they were in a kind of version of a drawing room. And here was a gentleman reading with a book, and he actually had a book. If he'd put the book down and just done that, he would have been part of the way to theatre. But several people recorded the extraordinary moment when he was reading Sikes and Nancy, where he virtually threw the book aside and started to batter Nancy to death. That must have been a great moment.
Yes. That leads on to a question from a scholar who's based in Italy. She's asking, when Dickens first thinks about becoming a public reader, he asks Forster whether it would be infra dig or beneath him to do it. Forster thinks so and discouraged it at this point. Can you comment on this concern by Forster and how a public reader was perceived at this point in time?
Yes. It goes back to this this question of Dickens realizing that he had to walk a tightrope between being surrendering to theatre, much as his impulses would have led him to, and being the gentlemanly evening dress figure, reading and acting a little bit from a book. And Forster reacted very strongly against this idea of Dickens making himself a public spectacle for money. He wasn't bothered when Dickens gave charity readings, but he was doing it for money. And so Dickens is very careful in one of these, I can't remember where it is. This is probably a means of strengthening those relations. Personal friendship was my great privilege and my responsibility to hold. Thus it is that I come quite naturally to be here among you at this time and to read this little book quite as composedly as I might proceed to write it. So there's nothing theatrical about it. It's perfectly natural. It's not artificial. And I think that's the stress that he makes in speech after speech in the early days when he is subject to these sorts of criticisms. Why is a gentleman demeaning himself in this way?
That leads nicely on to another question, which is we know that Dickens earned a healthy amount from his lecture tours, but do you think that this was the main reason, or that his main aim was this relationship with the audience that he was trying to encourage and foster?
Well, I think both. I think the money was immensely reassuring. He had high expenses, especially after the family broke up. And he wanted to live reasonably well. He did a lot of entertaining. But of course, from his childhood experiences, he was insecure about money. So it was a great security to have that. And it brought in much more. I mean, his average earnings from his writings each year was averaged out was just below £3,000. It's been estimated. Well, I mean, he could get 1,000 guineas from 25 readings. So you could see the profit. He came away from America with something like just over £2 million in profit, 2 million in current figures from that tour of America. But I think it's been well said that the one, Dickens's family broke up. He lost loved ones here and there, but the one enduring love relationship that he had in his life was the one he had with his reading public. And I think that probably addresses it.
One, I think probably the last question that we're going to be able to manage. This is from Christine Corton, who says, "Thanks, Malcolm, for such an excellent lecture. I wonder how you would compare Dickens' relationship to his reader and Anthony Trollope's, where Trollope often involves the reader with novelistic devices or plots he will use quite openly." So I think it's about that direct address to the reader that Trollope kind of involves himself in at times.
Sorry, the question again.
I wondered how you would compare Dickens' relationship to his readers and Anthony Trollope's, where Trollope often involves the reader with novelistic devices or plots that he'll use quite openly.
Yes, Dickens is altogether bolder, I think, and more insistent. I mean, it's an interesting question. You're more aware, I think, of Dickens as a presence, almost as another character in his novels, even when it's not first-person novel like Copperfield or Great Expectations. There's an insistent sense that you're aware of the storyteller, conjurer, magician at work, manipulating, making fanciful metaphors, cracking jokes, digging you in the ribs now and again, as well as conjuring this extraordinary realistic world. And I think Trollope recedes more from that. I mean, you're certainly aware of him there judging, but he does it with perhaps greater subtlety. So he's certainly in a more muted way than Dickens. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much once again for a wonderful lecture and for your generosity in addressing these questions. And thank you to our audience for attending.